The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Is this presidential election over? Has Joe Biden wrapped things up, or does President Trump still have a shot at overturning the current result? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. As the nation and the world increasingly recognize Joe Biden as the president-elect, the Trump legal team fights on, trying to convince various courts that the casting and counting of votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, and elsewhere was fraught with fraud. We'll examine the investigation ordered up by Attorney General Bill Barr into election irregularities with LibertyNation.com managing editor Mark Angelides, who will also discuss the growing schism between progressives and traditional liberals in the House of Representatives. In just a moment, we'll play you the analysis of a guy who has uncovered some statistical anomalies or impossibilities in Biden's reported victory. And if you thought this was the first time an election's been surrounded by allegations of voter fraud, think again. We'll take you back to an election in which the loser was convinced that he won. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza examines threats and promising developments regarding your individual liberty on Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. Is it President-elect Joe Biden yet? It is not until the members of the Electoral College say so by casting their votes more than 1 month from now on December 14th, with the votes actually counted on January 5th, 2 weeks before the presidential inauguration on January 20th. And even though all of major media has called the election that actually doesn't have any legal standing as the Trump campaign ramps up its legal action in multiple states, foremost among them Pennsylvania. If he can't somehow reverse the current Biden lead of near 50,000 votes in the Keystone State, Trump will have no chance to flip the election. And to do so, he'll likely have to get the Supreme Court to throw out all mail-in ballots received there after November 3rd, which would have happened before the election, but for Chief Justice John Roberts siding with the progressives on the Supreme Court and letting a law stand that was not passed by the Pennsylvania legislature, but rather commanded by the liberal governor and majority Democrat Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now, for his part, Joe Biden says Trump is only hurting himself with his insistence on challenging the outcome.
I just think it's an embarrassment, quite frankly. The only thing that, how can I say this tactfully? I think it will not help the president's legacy. I think that I know from my discussions with foreign leaders thus far that they are hopeful that the United States democratic institutions are viewed once again as being strong and enduring. But I think at the end of the day, it's all going to come to fruition on January 20th. And between now and then, my hope and expectation is that the American people do know and do understand that there has been a transition.
Well, I'll tell you this, as we heard right there, if you feel exhausted by the Trump presidency, you'll get a nice long rest and may even have trouble staying awake if Joe Biden does indeed become president. The operative word would be somnambulistic. But while at least half the nation is celebrating the apparent defeat of President Trump, the vanquishing of pure evil in the eyes of Democrats and progressives, many or most in the other half continue in their outrage and defiance, triggered by more and more reports of widespread irregularities in battleground states and entire blocks of tens of thousands of votes going 100% for Biden and the like. And listen to how Secretary of State Mike Pompeo answered a transition to a Biden administration question and was later buttonholed by Brett Baer of Fox News.
Is the State Department currently preparing to engage with the Biden transition team? And if not, at what point does a delay hamper a smooth transition or pose a risk to national security?
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
You were asked today about the concerns about a smooth transition, and you said there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. Were you being serious there?
We'll have a smooth transition, and we'll see what the people ultimately decided when all the votes have been cast. We have a process, Brett. The Constitution lays out how electors vote. It's a very detailed process laid out. We need to comply with all of that, and then I am very confident that we will have a good transition, that we will make sure that whoever is in office on noon on January 20th has all the tools readily available so that we don't skip a beat.
Pompeo's appearance there was, of course, on Fox News, which is really feeling the heat from its conservative viewers after calling Arizona for Biden extraordinarily early on election night and then calling a 5-seat gain for Democrats in the House, when in the end they'll likely lose more than 5 seats. All of that after Fox's Chris Wallace seemed to target Trump as moderator in the first debate. And it got even worse this week when afternoon host Neil Cavuto decided to summarily cut off a briefing from White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany.
We want maximum transparency. We want every legal vote to be counted, and we want every illegal vote to be...
I just think we have to be very clear. She's charging, the other side is welcoming fraud and welcoming illegal voting. Unless she has more details to back that up, I can't in good countenance continue showing you this. I want to make sure that maybe they do have something to back that up, but that's an explosive charge to make, that the other side is effectively rigging and cheating. If she does bring proof of that, of course, we'll take you back. So far, she has started saying right at the outset, welcoming fraud, welcoming illegal voting. Not so fast.
That action, that attitude is exactly why viewers are leaving Fox in droves. But I'll tell you this, if Fox thinks it can replace all the viewers abandoning them, good luck with that. Whatever happened to we report, you decide? Well, a political commentator named Steve Cortez, for one, has done some serious reporting on statistical anomalies or virtual impossibilities in the voting in battleground states, starting with the issue of turnout.
Turnout was exceedingly high, and in the places that Joe Biden needed it. Again, that defies logic. In Wisconsin, for example, statewide turnout was over 90%. To put that in context, the country of Australia, voting is mandatory. You get fined if you don't vote, and their turnout is only 92%. Turnout in Milwaukee was a stunning 84%. It's pretty hard to believe if you put it in comparison with another Midwestern city, similar demographics, similar size, Cleveland. Turnout was only 51%. Are we really to believe that Milwaukee naturally had turnout that much higher than Cleveland?
And Cortez points to vote-rich Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, and the staggering vote for Biden there.
In 2012, Obama got 233,000 votes in Montgomery County. But look at what happened this year for Biden. He got 313,000 votes in Montgomery County. He more than doubled Obama's margin of victory in Montgomery County. Is it really possible that this lazy and doddering candidate, Joe Biden, was able to so massively outperform a politician with rock star appeal like Barack Obama?
Then there is the matter of so many ballots with votes only for president.
Let's look nationally. 450,000 Biden-only tickets. That is ballots. That is very, very suspicious. Let's look at the state of Georgia. The difference, president versus Senate. There are 2 Senate races going on in Georgia, so a lot of interest there. Trump, this is the differential. Trump versus the combined Republican Senate vote. The differential was only 818 votes. Absolutely minimal considering he got 2.4 million votes in total in Georgia. In other words, almost everyone who voted for Trump also voted down ticket, voted for the senators. Biden, though, a 95,000 vote differential. There were almost 96,000 people in Georgia, allegedly, who voted Biden only and then did not vote for Senate. That seems far too wide to be believable.
And finally, there's the matter of so incredibly few rejected mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania.
In Pennsylvania, the rejection rate of mailed-in ballots was only 0.03%. Okay, now, that is 1/30th of the normal rate in the state of Pennsylvania. And mind you, for first-time voters, the typical failure rate is 3%, so 100 times higher than the rejection rate in Pennsylvania. New York, right next door, when they went to large-scale mail-in voting for their primary, they had a rejection rate of 21%. That is 700 times higher than what we saw in Pennsylvania.
Add those figures, those virtual statistical impossibilities, to the huge voting blocks that came in 100% for Biden and likely much more. And there's a lot for the Trump campaign to bring to court. But their time will soon run out to convince the country that this is anything more than just sour grapes. But there's also the matter of the U.S. Senate, which hangs in the balance pending the outcome of 2 Senate races in Georgia coming up on January 5th, more than 7 weeks away. Democrats need to win both seats to get to 50-50, where Kamala Harris could break ties. But Republicans worried that losing control of the Senate on top of the House and the presidency would lead to radical action by the Democrats. We're doubtless comforted by this statement by the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Conservatives far and wide hope and pray that Manchin holds to that position. He's from a bright red state, but rest assured he'll come under enormous pressure from his party if there's a vote that stands at 50-49, hinging on his decision. Quick break, and then a trip back in time to the last presidential election, widely believed to be decided by voter fraud.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
What is a president to do when depressing election results keep trickling in? The media's proclaimed your defeat and your opponent has declared victory, but you're convinced in your heart and mind that the election was stolen. The decision facing the 45th president at this hour is no doubt agonizing. How far to go and how long to fight before succumbing to forces beyond even the control of the most powerful man in the world? For Trump and his followers who believe this is a pure theft of the presidency, and that it's unprecedented in American history or something new under the sun, rest assured it is not. Cold comfort that it may be, this would not be the first instance of a modern presidential election shrouded in doubt. In 2000, Al Gore refused to concede to George W. Bush for 36 days after Election Day. That fight was over less than 1,000 votes in a single state, Florida, in the closest election in American history. But Democrats to this day believe that George W. Bush lost and was an illegitimate president. But a more apt parallel came in 1960, when an excruciatingly tight election was called for John F. Kennedy. Top advisors surrounding his opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, knew there was something fishy. Widespread allegations of voter fraud in 2 states in particular could well have led to recounts or legal action. Let's just say the Democratic machine in Chicago, by the way, strikingly similar to the one running Philadelphia today, came through in spades, delivering Illinois for JFK, as did the powerhouse Democratic State Party in Texas under the tight control of Kennedy's running mate Lyndon Johnson. Faced with an opportunity to fight on, initiate lawsuits, and demand recounts in those states and perhaps others, Nixon made the hard decision to accept the outcome. Many decried his decision, but it ultimately proved personally profitable, at least when Nixon won the presidency 8 years later. So President Trump's now facing the same dilemma as Richard Nixon 60 years ago. If he carries the fight too long, he risks damaging his legacy of historic accomplishments. If he gives up too quickly, it would be dispiriting to the movement he single-handedly ignited and which shows every sign of continuing, no matter the ultimate disposition of electoral votes. If he concedes gracefully, half the nation will applaud while the other half will jeer. He's truly damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. The enemies who spent every waking hour since the shock election of 2016 discounting the outcome and launching one political nuclear bomb after another at the man are feeling the burn. Their plan of personal destruction complete, salivating at the dream of Trump being marched out of the White House in leg irons. At the same time, many or most of the 72 million plus who voted for Trump will turn their heads in disgust, certain that no matter whether the Democrats continue spiking the ball and Trump concedes, they will never accept that this election was free and fair. At some point soon, it'll become a matter of President Trump maintaining both his indomitable spirit and his dignity, even as his supporters find that impossible. But no matter the manner in which Donald Trump might ultimately choose to depart, he gets to be president of the United States for at least another 70 days. Ample time to put the final exclamation points on his presidency like no other. We'll break away for a moment, then come back to discuss the investigation ordered up by the Attorney General Bill Barr into election irregularities and the growing schism between progressives and traditional liberals in the House of Representatives.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Attorney General Bill Barr has authorized prosecutors in the Department of Justice to look into allegations of voter fraud in the 2020 election. Unsurprisingly, media organizations appear to be launching a concerted effort to decry the investigation and are making a case that no inquiry whatsoever should be taking place. So is this something the DOJ should be investigating? Or is it a Don Quixote impossible dream to believe there was sufficient fraud in the casting and counting of ballots to overturn the current projections and give Donald Trump a second term? Joining us to weigh in on these weighty questions and on the growing schism between progressives and traditional liberals in the House of Representatives is LibertyNation.com managing editor Mark Angelides. Welcome back, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Always great to have you back. Now, in his memo, Attorney General Barr said, quote, "Nothing here should be taken as any indication that the department has concluded that voting irregularities have impacted the outcome of any election," unquote. But this type of investigation is a somewhat extraordinary thing for the nation's top law enforcement official to undertake. Do you think it's because of specific allegations that have come across Barr's desk, or more the sum total of anecdotal stories forcing him to at least take a look into them for the sake of clarity, if nothing else?
Well, it's not egregious for the nation's top cop to be looking into alleged crimes, especially as they do span the country. I suspect that he knows more than you and I know, that the media in general knows. And if it seems to him that what is happening is, let's call it systemic, as in it was a scheme that operated across multiple states, then he really does need to look into it deeply, for no other reason than to give the public back their trust and faith in the voting system. Because without that, we'll see chaos at every election. We'll see a drop in voter numbers. We'll see turmoil, the likes of which the country has probably never seen. They need an answer, and if not the nation's top cop to give it, then who else?
So which is a more apt description of the reaction among Democrats and their backers in the media, that they're trying to ignore this investigation and the widespread reports about fraud, or that they're fearful of what Barr might find and how it will hurt Democrats going forward to the 2022 midterm elections, even if the outcome we're seeing now is not overturned?
I'd suggest that Democrats don't want any investigations to go forward because it casts doubt on the legitimacy of President Biden if that comes to pass. But in terms of trying to control the narrative that there's no need for an investigation, this is perhaps more a long-term investment for the Democrats. What they should be doing is supporting the investigation, cooperating, and then if it's found out that they did nothing wrong and that the electoral system is intact, then it would turn out better for everybody all along. So what needs to happen really is that the few regular voting anomalies that always take place from both sides, those need to be ignored, but then look at if there is any widespread fraud or corruption. These things need to be looked into. So, for example, at the moment, we've got questions about the Dominion voting machines. We've got questions about Maidengate. We've got questions about dead folks on voter rolls, or votes being counted or tabulated incorrectly, and of course votes not being canvassed properly or not being received properly. These are big things that if they're not looked into now, if they go uncovered, then the public will think, 2022, 2024 and beyond, these things could happen again and again and again.
Why did the Justice Department investigator who specializes in election crimes suddenly resign when Barr called for an investigation of alleged election crimes?
Well, I think that was as Richard Pilger. He says that it was in line with the award of his office, like the highest award his office can get is to do with integrity and professionalism. And to me, that seems like a strange stance, because he's a prosecutor. He's a federal prosecutor. And if you consider what a prosecutor has to do, they have to the best of their ability, prosecute crimes, same as a defender should, to the best of their ability, defend a crime. And if there is no crime, well, that's irrelevant. The chips should fall where they may. So to resign saying that this is about integrity, to me, that smacks more of bias and a lack of integrity.
the terms unfounded and baseless being used by the media far and wide, along with my favorite term, without evidence, to discredit Trump's position that there's been widespread voter fraud. It's likely due to their own incuriosity or laziness, or refusal to actually examine what the Trump team is alleging in its legal pleadings. But what about all those sworn affidavits by witnesses? Is that not evidence?
It absolutely is. I clarified this point on a recent Liberty Nation television with our legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza, also your co-host on the Uprising podcast, that affidavits are evidence. They are sworn testimony. And, crimes all over the world are prosecuted on affidavits, testimony. They're big, they're important, that they're often the most important element to prosecution. So we have 234 pages of affidavits that Kayleigh McEnany was talking about the other day. There are, according to Rudy Giuliani, there are 11,000, I think it was 11,000 other pieces of evidence that they've gathered up. And what you say about the use of the terms unfounded and baseless, and of course without evidence. And also you mentioned widespread. It amuses me a little to see how all of the media organizations tend to be using the same language, saying it's unfounded, baseless. There's no widespread voter fraud. And when you think about these words, so widespread, the antonym of widespread is targeted. Mm-hmm. And now, to me, in an election where it's all about swing states, the opposite of widespread being targeted, that actually makes a lot of sense. So when they're talking about there's no widespread fraud, well, so you're saying there's targeted fraud. It's a linguistic acrobatics of the mind, yes, for them to use these terms, because in all honesty, they assume that everybody else is dumb.
So
or
what
at least
they
dumber than they are.
So what they want is for whatever evidence they have to be, however voluminous it might be, for it to be presented at the White House press conference by Kayleigh McEnany. Otherwise, it's considered unfounded, when in fact all of this is taking place in courtrooms across the country. Now, let's switch gears here, because you've also written about what you call a quiet war going on in the House of Representatives, progressives and mainstream factions fighting it out for the soul of the party, so to speak, after they lost seats in the House when they were expected to pick up seats. And since Joe Biden is seen as merely a placeholder in the White House, how are sides drawn up in the House, and who seems to have the edge in the formulation of policy going forward?
I think that all depends on who was promised what for their support. That's the big question. What promises were made behind closed doors? At the moment, I would say it's the progressive faction that has the whip hand, as it were, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the squad members. She has such coverage among the media that it's going to appear to the voting public, whether this is true or not, but to the voting public, even the Democrats, that the progressives have the impetus on their side. However, the moderates own the machinations. They own the committees. They own the state operations, the people, the ground crews in many of the important states. So it's going to be a messy fight. That's the reality of it. So it looks like the progressives have the upper hand, but I think the moderates have the power base. So one way or the other, it's going to be messy.
Okay, Mark, thanks as always for joining us from across the pond there. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Mark Angelides, managing editor of LibertyNation.com. Stay right there, because we're coming back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time many would say beyond time for us to welcome back our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor for the section of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitled Talkin' Liberty. Hello, Scott Cosenza.
Hi, Tim. Thank you.
Good to have you with us back again. A lot of litigation pending in the courts across the country about the election. Summarize for us as best you can where things stand.
You know, Tim, let's take a pause for a moment and just have a moment of sympathy for the legal affairs analysts around the country who have to read all these suits as they come in. It's downright cruel to have so much litigation ongoing. There are multiple state and federal lawsuits going on concerning litigation. The big case I would suggest is in the United States Supreme Court. That just has to do with Pennsylvania votes that were received by mail after Election Day. That's still the big case, and we have no guidance yet from the Supreme Court whether they're going to have a hearing on that case or how they may proceed with it. It's sort of a black box right now. The Trump administration won a minor victory in a Pennsylvania state court this week when they found that the Secretary of State inappropriately granted people whose ballots were submitted by mail. Now, this gets very technical, okay? So people whose ballots were submitted by mail after Election Day, whose identities were not verified. Those persons were given extra time to verify their identities. The state court has ruled that that was inappropriate and that those people, their votes will not count. Now, the total number there, Tim, is very small likely. I don't have an exact count for you. There's also state and federal litigation, I believe, in Michigan, and around the Horn, we have got many others to choose from. But I think the Supreme Court case in Pennsylvania is sort of the big one for us to keep our eye on, which may result in many votes being overturned. Now, whether that, the important question then is, could that make up the difference for Donald Trump, and could he win Pennsylvania's electoral votes, depending on any remedy that they may craft? And the answer to that question is I don't know.
When are we likely to find out about Pennsylvania? Because if Trump can't flip that state, the rest of it really won't matter.
Well, the Supreme Court justices do not discuss with me their
not
scheduling.
This time,
unfortunately, it would be so convenient if they did. But we're just going to have to wait. So we have an order from Justice Alito that came down on the 6th of November, and in that order, he said that he would immediately forward the case to his brother and sister justices on the court for further action, if any. That's the last communication we have from the court directly on the matter. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Okay, now, Scott, before the election, there was a lot of talk during the confirmation process of Amy Coney Barrett about a big case revolving around Obamacare at the Supreme Court. The Democrats basically were saying what the Trump administration is trying to do is to take away pre-existing conditions and remove the entire safety net of Obamacare. So tell us about what's going on with Obamacare at the Supreme Court.
So Obamacare, Tim, when it was initially challenged at the Supreme Court, as I know that you have discussed on this show before, Justice John Roberts was the key swing vote in allowing it to be ruled a legal measure, a constitutional piece of legislation, because he called it a tax. And as a tax, it was allowed to go through. Then, years later, the Congress took that tax down to zero, which is to say there is no actual dollar tax that's associated with Obamacare. So then can you have a revenue measure or a tax if no dollars are coming in on that tax, if it's a tax of $0? And if not, Tim, then does that make the whole rest of the law unconstitutional? As soon as that tax was zeroed out, some anti-Obamacare attorneys general basically started this action to try to get the whole thing thrown out. And then, so the court, when it heard the case this past week, what they focused in on was a couple of questions. The first question was, do the states even have, or the individuals? So there was a number of plaintiffs in the case, including the state of Texas and some individuals who all have said they're damaged by the Obamacare tax, even though it's a $0 tax. And the first question the court will answer is whether those people had standing to sue. And based on their questions at argument, I think it's an open question. Then the other question, if they say, yes, they did have standing to sue Tim, and they agree that that provision is then unconstitutional, then we have what's called the question of severability. And the court then goes to see whether or not they would allow the rest of the legislation to stand, even though that one particular piece might be unconstitutional. And based on sort of reading of the tea leaves and judging by the justices' questions, it seems like a majority of the court, including and especially on the conservative side, Justice Kavanaugh, would be inclined to call that provision severable and to cut it out of the rest of Obamacare and leave the rest. Now, there is a possibility, though, that that won't be the case, and they will say that because Congress had the opportunity to sever it and didn't, when they reduced the tax to zero, that means the whole thing can be thrown out. But that's increasingly looking like the small percentage result rather than keeping the rest of Obamacare and just excising that odious portion.
All right, let's move from Washington up to New York, where Governor Andrew Cuomo has laid down another mandate that is turning some heads. What is it, Scott?
Well, it's insufficiently restrictive, I guess, is how the regulations have gone there on the coronavirus side. And he's now said that you have to have 10 or fewer people in any gathering in your home. They're now restricting, Tim, the number of people that can gather privately in a person's home. I think it is a leap in terms of the impositions on people's freedom in the coronavirus pandemic, and I expect it to be challenged in going up the courts because it's so great an imposition on people's freedom. They told the Hasidim they couldn't go to school, and now they can't even meet in their own houses in New York. I mean, it's breathtaking, I think.
Meanwhile, last week we talked about a surprising decision by the voters in California on affirmative action, refusing to reinstitute affirmative action in the Golden State. This week, affirmative action back in the news because an appeals court has ruled in favor of Harvard in an affirmative action case, paving the way for a trip right up the ladder to the Supreme Court.
That's right, Tim. Harvard notoriously discriminates against Asians and whites and men in favor of favored recipients of admission, basically. And the appellate courts have now ruled that that's okay, that consistent with Supreme Court precedent, the outcome that leads to Asians with exceedingly high qualifications being denied entrance while others with much lower scores of preferred races, black and brown people, that's okay, according to Supreme Court precedent. And I think that's probably right in terms of an accurate reading of the precedent itself. But we're going to see now, Tim, whether Amy Coney Barrett's presence on the court, where it's going to bear fruit in all sorts of areas. And one of them, I think, will be affirmative action. The Supreme Court will have to agree to take this case, and they haven't yet. I don't want to give that false impression. But the entirety of this litigation was designed to present that question before the court, and this is the next step in that process. It has been completed.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole with Mark Angelides, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. And don't forget about our new Roku channel. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.